everyone. Today we have our another new episode. This is very, very important and interesting topic. Uh, we will discuss how big business can support small business or small medium enterprise. And this is very, very important because you know that World Talent Economy Forums, we are working for emerging economy. Definitely, we are supporting different social entrepreneurs, different uh, industrial organizations, those who actually helping to grow this emerging economy. So hopefully this discussion will be very much interesting. First, I would like to give chance, Mr. Eric.
So, one thing to look at is what is the difference in the motivations and methods for big business versus small and medium-sized enterprises. And, sometimes I look at big business more as a problem and looking at solutions. In other words, their focus is on solving big problems. Let's get a problem first. We'll put all the pieces together. We'll solve that problem. And they like to solve that problem because they have so many resources and reach by planning and executing. So by understanding the problem or the market and by putting a plan together and executing. And that's a really great thing when you get all those things aligned and people go in. Problems come, they can throw hardware and software and people and connections and even politics, and it's a good thing. Having worked for $1 billion software company as well as a startup company and everything in between, I know the other end is often a solution looking for problems to solve. We have this solution. We can do AI, we do Internet of Things, we do this, and they're more a solution looking for a problem to solve with, and they tend to be flexible and more agile in being able to solve that problem. So one of the first things that a big business can do to support an SME is be very clear on what they need in terms of defining problems that they could be able to solve. I mean, the government does this very well by saying, here's a request for a proposal or tender if you're overseas, and, go solve this problem for me. The other thing that small SMEs can do for big business is kind of sensors in the marketplace, because big businesses don't often like to move until they really understand the problem and can move. For example, I remember putting up a proposal for actually a solution for a large company like Boeing. And Boeing said, oh, we can't do this because the opportunity isn't more than $1 million. So it took them $1 million just to think about the opportunity. And I tried to say, well, no, you don't need to do that this time because we already want what you have. I've got somebody to pay for it. You don't need to do a black hat, a red hat screening. You don't need to build prototypes. You just need to say, here's what you have with prototype. But they actually couldn't do that. And I've had similar experiences with General Dynamics and other companies where, if they take on a problem, they commit resource and they have a method of doing that. They're not very good at getting out of that method, whereas small companies are pretty easy. So if a big company wants to explore solutions or problems, they can actually make partnerships and have efforts with small companies who can go find out and feel out where this market is and do potentially beneficial thing. And an example of that is Qualcomm. Qualcomm will take individual groups within them and let them explore things and actually even turn them into companies. So they actually create small SMEs from within, let's say Qualcomm, and some of those actually have done very well and skyrocket in that. So I guess the first thing they can do is provide business. Second thing they can do is provide partnerships. And the third thing they can do, big businesses, provide resources, connections, facilities to work out of sometimes. Again, the government labs are really good at this because They can provide a capability, but they don't have a distribution of that. An example is they come up with an acoustic technology that turns out to work really well in ultrasound, but they don't have a way of exploring that ultrasound market. So the company takes that, they put that into packaging. And so sometimes SMEs can be good at packaging and things like that, where the big companies can be very good at production. So once that goes, they can take that over and do that. So there's a lot more, but I want to not hog all the speaking time here. But that's a few things that big businesses can do for SMEs.
Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Eric, that's an excellent list to get started there. I love some of the definitions there, but as we begin to look at small and medium-sized companies, there's different definitions in most countries. For example, in the U.S., it's a small business according to ownership structure, earnings, and number of employees. And for example, manufacturing, a small and medium-sized business is a firm with 500 or fewer employees. So you begin to see that. And in Canada, they have micro businesses and small businesses. And a small business there is less than 99 employees. In the EU, it's still a different definition, and it's fewer than 50 employees there. In China, it's a bit less than 49 employees. And in most developing nations, they go by different names, including micro, small, medium size businesses there. In most emerging countries, the small, medium-sized businesses are roughly 50% of the total employment and 40% of the GDP in these countries, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So you see there's a lot of different definitions. But for example, in the United States, small businesses comprise about 99% of all firms in the United States. So you can see how important this can be and what you can do with it. And I agree with the things which Eric began to say is how can you work with them? One of them is I have very successfully in the past partnered with large companies to work directly with it. I've partnered with them both as me as a subcontractor to them on projects, to them as subcontractor to me on projects where it was a small business set aside project and others like that. And I've actually, in some of the programs here in the Department of Defense business I've done, my companies have been a protege multiple times to large companies, in this instance, Raytheon and IBM, in doing work for different agencies in the Department of Defense. You also begin to look at other things they can do is they have their campaigns to where large business can be a mentor for you. And that is what the DoD program was really about and how it can be done. But there's many places where small businesses can be supported. Many of these large companies have innovation incubators, or they have corporate venture capital arms that can provide support to small and medium-sized businesses. And I have used those before in companies like Intel, Microsoft, IBM, Qualcomm, many others. You see that they have these funds set aside to help innovation, and most of that is small and medium-sized businesses doing it. There's also something called catalyst funding that large corporations do with small businesses. And you see that happening, again, quite a bit in these companies. The other thing is you partner with larger business, they can help you with cash flow. One of the things with several of the companies which we partnered with as a small business is they really helped us on the cash flow side, and they helped us get access to resources that we as a small business could not have access to. So these types of things really help small businesses, and particularly if your small business is located in an area and you want to do work globally, the large corporations can go a long way to help facilitate that type of access for a small and medium-sized business. So Sharif, I think that is a good start.
Thank you. Now I request Mr. Michael. Mr. Michael.
Yes, thank you very much. I will be quite shorter because my question is, why should we differentiate big and small? Nature does not do it. Why should we do it? Because what we can do together can we do much more better if there are no silos, and big and small is one of the silos. So the question is, why not to put it together? Why not to work together generally in a way? Because as Mr. David described, there are different criteria how to define what is big, what is small, what is micro. It's not needed. So in Industry 5.0, my recommendation is to really to break the silos, to start to work together without the limits given by there are artificial limits generally. So we shouldn't make them living, and we should go back to the roots and start working together instead of competing against each other, because this is not what is delivering the right results. So that's my point at the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rob.
Well, we're talking about big business helping small business. The mechanisms that are in place that I'm aware of are largely incubators. Most of the large companies I work with have some form of incubator program. These programs are put in place to identify technologies that could be of use to the company or technologies that could threaten the company long term. Now, there are two aspects of this, one beneficial, one problematic. With regard to technologies that could help the firm, what that does is it creates a certain amount of competition between the internal groups that are developing these technologies and the external funded groups. These external organizations are both benefit from funding and executive resources that help the companies advance it. And to a large extent, it's goodness, but do recognize it also comes with a fairly distinct amount of risk, because the end game could very well be the large company acquiring the small company, either to eliminate a growing competitor or to take a technology inside the firm that exceeds the capability of the technology that was being developed there. Now, this creates some really interesting dynamics. One of the dynamics it creates is for the groups that are competing with the small companies that are being funded, there is a certain amount of aggravated competition. And I say aggravated competition because it means the internal group certainly wants to defend their jobs and their prospects. And so they'll view the external company that's being put up against them as a threat. And because they're internal as opposed to external, they're better positioned politically to drive the process. And thus they can, in some cases, cripple the efforts that are helping the smaller firm or provide knowingly false advice or problematic issues to make sure the small firm doesn't grow up to be the threat that it could be. The other thing is that when you're down a path of acquiring potential competitors, it reduces competition. And when you reduce competition from the standpoint of the firm's health long term, the large firm's health long term, that makes them very insular. It makes them very vulnerable to competition they haven't identified or properly addressed. Use classical as an example. I wrote one of the several papers on IBM's near collapse, and one of the problems that they'd had is they became isolated and were completely unaware of the competitive dynamics that were outside. You want a very vibrant ecosystem if a company is to survive, and the company has to aggressively compete in that ecosystem. If it starts cash cowing its various efforts, much like Intel did under BK 3 CEOs ago, the company will languish. It will lose its positions and will eventually pass or die. We'll see if Pat Gelsinger can turn Intel around, but it's clearly becoming a very difficult process for him, much like it was with Louis Gerstner at IBM several decades back. So in the end, The programs that exist for the companies have tremendous benefits, but they also have significant risks. Risks to long-term independence, which often isn't the goal of a small company. Often a small company is looking for that big buyout, that future investment. And the issue, of course, for the rank and file is that buyout investment is just for the intellectual property. You're screwed. If it's for the entire company, you may also be screwed. I've been acquired a number of times throughout my career. It's never ended well. Often the acquiring company uses a set of very bad practices, which include a tremendous desire to make the acquired company look like the acquiring company, and in the process, they cripple the acquired company and destroy it. Sadly, that happens more often than the right way to do this, which is the Dell IBM method, where you go in and you identify the assets in the company you want to preserve, and then you make sure those assets are preserved, and thus the company that's being acquired largely remains, in many cases, independent and able to function. So because that was the very reason why it was acquired. But you also have companies that acquire just for their intellectual property, and that sadly is another best practice. It's better to acquire for intellectual property than try to do an integration merger, because at least then you've taken into account the fact that the acquired company will be collapsed, and you plan for it. Where if you do an acquisition merger and you kill the company, generally the acquiring company doesn't plan for that, and it becomes a catastrophic outcome for both firms. Look at IBM's acquisition of Rome Systems, which I was part of. As an example, Rome Systems no longer exists in any way, shape, or form. Though frankly, it was killed by Siemens completely, but though IBM crippled it to a degree that would have never recovered. So looking at the programs of large companies, just recognize that large companies have their own interests at heart. If they're like Dell and they've created programs designed to preserve and help small companies, it's a good firm to work for. I would argue that Intel historically has done very well as a helper, but also they've destroyed an awful lot of companies. The McAfee, for instance, was a recent nearly destroyed company by Intel, also done under BK. The prior CEO. So even when a company has historically behaved well, the changing in executive leadership or the management of these partner programs can result in some very dire outcomes for the partner. So you have to be aware of the risks of working with a large firm. Recognize that you may not reach a point of being all that interesting to the firm unless you represent a threat, and they're more likely to try to eliminate the threat than try to embrace it, which is the natural tendency that we all have when we see a threat. So recognizing that, you can go to these things with your eyes open, make sure that you have developed relationships with senior executive management. If things happen, you have an escalation path to address them. Take the advice with a grain of salt, particularly if you're competing with an internal group, and recognize that with that internal group competition, you have a political requirement to establish yourself in and with the company so that you can compete for resources, and that you won't get blindsided, cut off, or catastrophically acquired when you least expect it. This is not a game for the weak-hearted. You need to go into it with your eyes open and understand as quickly as you can the politics and political dynamics so that you can survive the process. And if you do, then the thing can be very beneficial. If you don't, you're going to kiss the company goodbye. And maybe the senior executives all get rich and can retire on desert islands. But if you're rank and file, you're pretty much going to be screwed. So avoiding that screwed part becomes your predominant goal as you go through the underlying process.
Thank you. Now I request Madam Ali Rice.
Hi. Okay. Well, my experience is really from a service industry point of view, and I was involved with a national campaign called Creative Partnerships. So that actually encouraged practitioners that ran their own businesses to come into schools to tackle education, because there was so many pupils that were becoming disengaged. So and my experience has been through incubators, kind of catalyzing things. There's also research and development grants for small businesses from people like Nesta's the biggest endowment company in the UK, and that supports science, technology, and the arts. And I also think that one of the things that always kind of resonates with me is there's a brand in the UK that was established here called Innocent Drinks, and that was organic, freshly squeezed juices. And lots of people don't realize that that's been acquired by Coca-Cola, and that kind of ethics behind that company. It's because there's kind of an argument for both things, actually. One, that there's another product that Coca-Cola offer that sells kind of healthy things as opposed to stuff that's got all kinds of chemicals and things in it. But there's also kind of a sellout from the original founder. So he made his money and kind of let his baby go, really. So, you know, it's kind of, I don't know, there's still an ethical kind of consciousness question about whether that's right or wrong, really. So, and definitely, I know from my own experience and with people that I know that small businesses can be really agile and react quickly and respond and diversify very quickly, and large businesses can't. So there's lots of kind of beauty in that kind of agility that a small business has got. So, and especially if you've got kind of a purpose and a mission to do what you do, so you're kind of transforming the way things are to kind of improve things. So, you know, for us, we kind of use creativity to promote positive change and kind of use a creative process to do so. And that kind of brings engagement to another level. So I think, you know, having that kind of the intellectual property and that kind of unique ability to kind of respond and do what needs. And then I think kind of securing that best practice and sharing it is the thing. So, and I think digitalizing it and taking online programs, you know, taking another level so you can digitize what you do is something that kind of bigger corporations can probably help with. But Nest is definitely one of the key organizations here that helps small businesses kind of reach another level or go into strategic partnerships. So I think, you know, that's probably the best way to go for small businesses. And there are kind of means to do it if you can kind of get through the phases and the loopholes to do it. So yeah, that's my first views.
Thank you. Now I request Dr. Talib Raphael.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope my voice is okay. It's okay?
Yeah.
All right. I want to say something about what Michael said, the distinction between the big and the small. I think he's right about this, but the fact is that there are characteristics about big companies that are different from those of the small companies. There are characteristics. The problem is where to draw the line between small and big. Where do you draw the line there? Now, I want to draw on the experience of the field I was working with for the last 20 years of my life, which is travel and tourism. Travel and tourism, for example, has 95% of its composition out of small and medium-sized businesses. It's not big businesses, as many people would expect, but the big businesses are there, and they are competing with the small businesses in many ways. They even differ in their outlook altogether. For example, how to deal with the local communities. The big businesses like Hilton's and the likes, and Sheraton's and all of that, they come to a certain place and try to impose this all-inclusive model, for example. This all-inclusive model is very bad to the local community because it separates the tourists from the local community. And what you have is only that it provides jobs for the local community, but these jobs are not very sustainable because these jobs are made for people that work in these companies, in these setups, and they serve the rich people of the world every time. They go back to their homes and see the difference in standards of living, especially in developing countries. And that would create some frustration in their minds. But the fact is that if these hotels and these big setups have decided to release some of their aspirations, some of their clients, and let them go outside and do something with the local community, for example, have lunch there, have a visit there, not to have all-inclusive inside the hotel, then that would create already systematically some jobs in the local community. Local communities would automatically have cafes and restaurants and souvenir shops and all of that, which is self-employment. Now, for young people, I think that they start their career working for big companies. Everyone likes to do that, but they end up their career many ways in working for small and medium size. My son, for example, is in Dubai. He worked for 5 years for a big company. Now he's resigned from it and he's starting his own setup, his own startup. That's something that I was really very worried about because they want some guaranteed income. And big companies are the only ones that can give you the guaranteed income. Small, medium size don't guarantee you anything unless you do it yourself. That's what I wanted to say now. Thank you. Thank you,
Thank you.
Sharif.
Excellent discussion. Excellent discussions. That is the things actually World Talent Economy Forum we are working. We are closely, very closely, we are working with emerging economy, country like India, Bangladesh. Today we are launching our partnership with the Gujarat Chamber of Commerce, as well as working with PPP Authority, BESA, Prime Minister Office of Bangladesh. We can understand the pain of small medium enterprise, even the emerging economy. So my second question, like, what type of strategy this kind of small SME can take? Because right now we have major economic challenges around the world because of war, especially country like Bangladesh or many other country, they cannot manage their energy, like energy. Uh, they cannot handle their employees, especially SME. They cannot manage their tax, and it's actually horrible scenario. In that situation, how SME can develop better strategy because of this Russia and Ukraine war? It create major problem in energy sectors, and it's really tough to survive in this challenging situation. Mr. Eddie, what do you want to say?
I kind of want to start in that vein with addressing what Michael had said is what's the difference? Small, medium, big, who cares? And to me, that's like saying, is there a difference between a sports car and a moving truck? Come on, they all have engines, they all have wheels and chassis, and they all drive on the same road. So what's the difference? And the difference really is at some point, the way you operate and what you do has to change. And it's just an emphasis on different skill sets for so everyone, and this addresses your question on strategy. They all have to worry about resources. Resources is a big thing. You can't do anything without data resources, people resources, physical resources. Resources are a big deal, but the other part of that is capabilities. If you're given these resources, what can you do with them? What do you know how to do with them? And then finally, you're putting that in terms of actions. The idea of we're going to put this resource with these capabilities and we're going to do this. And through that, we're going to create some kind of competitive advantage. So the key there is with this resource, you're doing your operations, but the other part of it is communications. How do you communicate and who can you communicate with? And I think Rob had a really good idea of what happens when you don't get that right. The reason a lot of these partnerships and acquisitions fail is you take some organization which has right-sized themselves with the right resources and the right capabilities, and they have the right operations and the right communications. And so we had, and when I worked for a large company, we had very successful acquisitions because all we really needed was the resources. We already had the operations and the communications down that worked for what we were doing. And so we could plug them in very quickly. And all of a sudden they were account managers and all kinds of things. And it worked really well. I mean, it was nearly seamless. But a lot of times I remember like the acquisition of companies like TRW, where they'd say, okay, now their key thing is the operations and the communications, and we want you to use our communications and do things our way. And we saw the failure of that with the big companies, the retail stores, where Creeks versus Kmart is if you try and do things the same way, at a Kmart level and a Walmart level, you try and do that the same thing was a Nordstrom, it doesn't work because it's not the same entity. And every time they tried to take this one entity and cram it into doing things the same way, it failed. So, we acquired you because you're really good at what you do. Now do things our way. Doesn't work so well. So either the acquisition that worked knew how to fit them already, it worked, or they had them already to the point where they just said, come join us. We're going to plug you in like a strategic business unit. We're going to let you do things your way. Maybe you have to use our operations to some extent, like our logistics or our travel or our ERP stuff, but you're still going to do your operations and communications your way. So that's a big thing. So what does that lead to strategy? Well, if you are a small company coming in, you have to realize you're mixing resources, capabilities, and turning that into competitive advantage. So the question is, what resources can a big company get that benefits you both? What capabilities could you give each other that it works? And what parts of operations or communications can we tap into their communications network? Communication, I mean the way you talk to your customers and the way you talk to each other. It makes a big difference depending on what you're doing, because if we were in a small company, I could just call David up in charge of engineering and say, hey, what do you think about this? And I could call Rob on design, and we could work stuff together. But as soon as it becomes a big company, we have all these different projects going on and we're all juggling things. It's a different skill set. So you have to be very cognizant of that small company as to what resources and capabilities you're putting into what actions with what communications to achieve what results. And you have to look in where a big company can help you and where you can help them. Because one thing big companies need to do is reduce risk. So if it's a short-term thing or a thing that isn't clear, you can do risk. And SMEs mitigate that by working on various customers so that you don't lose one. Big companies have so much going on that some things you can lose a $10 million deal over here, but get a 20 million over here. And so that they can keep going long term. So they're much better at that. And that's how they like to operate. So your strategy should be, what can we do short term to help each other? Where can we add flexibility? But keep the caveat that Rob put in mind is, you can get trapped. Or they can require you and insist that you do things their way when they are set up to optimize these resource capabilities for a certain product or a certain market, and that doesn't fit. So you have to watch that mindset of, we know everything because we're big and successful, so you need to do things our way. Well, they may be big and successful at what they do, but that doesn't mean that they are big and successful at what you do as an SME.
Thank you, Professor David Smith.
Eric, again, your comments are on, and so are yours, Rob, as we look at part of this too. My experience with being a small business working with large companies is that there's multiple doors you can enter into. Now, Rob talked about entering through their incubator if they have one, and Eric's talked about some more of the direct approaches. One of the places where I've been successful also is entering through where many of these large companies they have small business offices, because many contracts, particularly government contracts or contracts with the commercial companies that end up in the government, both in the United States and in EU and other places, have what they call small business set-asides. And for the large contractor to get them, they have to actually include small businesses on the contracts for this. And I've been very successful. I mean, millions of dollars worth of success going through the small business offices, both to become a partner with companies, but also to go in and get direct contracts to the small business office without having to partner with another large prime to do the work. The other place where I've been really successful with large companies is going to customers, particularly, once again, government agencies of different types, and do a search on what contracts do they have out that they're small business contracts. And some of the small business contracts actually go into the billions of dollars, but the small business has to be the prime, and they can add larger companies with them as subcontractors to them as a prime. And I've done that a number of times and have had some really good contracts. And as a small business at that time with less than 75 employees, it was great to have subcontractors on us, working with us, like IBM, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and others like that. So it made me, as a small business, actually up my prestige as I went and tried to get other contracts. So that is another approach to begin to use here. So remember, though, big companies can help small and medium-sized companies with funding, access to technology, access to clients, access to putting together joint ventures and partnerships at different areas. And large companies can actually be a direct subcontractor to small companies too, if the opportunity is great enough. I loved Eric's comment with that one company that it had to be $1 million to be interesting to them. Some of the companies I've worked with in the aerospace area and the space area, that figure is closer to 5 million for them to be interested in it. But that is where you really can, as a small business, pull in them as a prime, as a subcontractor, and have them work well with you. I hate to say it, but it's large businesses and small and medium-sized business, part of it's politics and it's relationships. Many relationships will help drive this. So there are small business mentorship meetings around the country all the time, put on by, in the United States, different agencies, different groups like that, different companies. Search those and find them in your area and sign up and register them, because the relationships really help you get over the finish line for a lot of these. And the other one that I like to mention is many of the big businesses will have special training systems set up for small and medium-sized business. Again, search and find these. They are not only a great way for you to get training, but again, you set up those relationships that can help you go through all the resources that big business can bring to bear. And finally, don't forget that the end customers are also an approach for you to go back and get support from big business. Because if you can sell an end customer on your idea, but you need to partner with the big business to fulfill it, it's a much easier introduction and sell in the big business than you trying to go it alone. So Sharif, those are some other approaches here. And I can tell you, as a CEO of a small business, I have successfully used all of those to bill millions of dollars to the end customers on those. And actually, just thinking here about it, it's really closer to $50 to $70 million over the time as a small business working with big businesses like this. So it can be done. It can be done very profitably. So Sharif, that's my answer.
Thank you. Mr. Michael.
Thank you for the explanation. Both has been really great. And because the question is how big businesses can support SMEs, I think that the first step should be to see them as equal partners, not to see them smaller and bigger. One example from the life, in a time of pandemic, from one day to another, the teachers and students should switch to digital and must switch to digital. And generally, the biggest issue in that was that generally teachers has been the big companies. Students has been the small companies, but not a single teacher asked the student to teach him how to use the technology. But the children know it much more better than the teachers themselves. So if they see each other equal, which is nature doing, then we will not have these problems. And the question will be of the next webinar will be maybe how big and small companies can support each other. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Mr. Rob.
Okay, one other concern I'll bring forward, since we kind of covered every other aspect of this. Years ago, Microsoft was, back through the 90s, was often accused of stealing information from the smaller companies they worked with. And it wasn't uncommon. Most large companies were accused of doing the same thing. And then looking at the process, what they decided to do is they were going to implement a program where they had a department. The sole purpose was to protect the small companies that worked with them. That department doesn't work anymore. It doesn't exist anymore. What was happening was these small companies would come in, they'd open the kimono, they'd show the larger company, in this case Microsoft, everything that they had, things that Microsoft hadn't requested, that was part of their pitch. And then they were surprised to discover, since they hadn't protected any of the stuff, that Microsoft suddenly had programs inside the company that were taking some of their most interesting ideas and turning them into products. Now, Microsoft claimed that really there was no cause and effect here, that they were working on similar things at the same time, but it's almost impossible to tell whether in fact that was the case. And the issue here is when you're engaging with any other company, particularly a larger firm, you need to play it close to the vest. You do not open the kimono, you do not share all your intellectual property until you have contracts in place that protect your interests. You don't walk in naively and tell the company everything you're planning and doing and the great ideas that you have, because that really is the basis for your firm. And if that larger company says, hey, yeah, you've got a great idea, Apple's famous for this, you've got a great idea, and then just go off and build it themselves, now you're a little company competing with a large company that basically has all your ideas and probably has harvested a bunch of your people in the process, and you're out of business and wonder what the heck happened. That you really do need, when you're working with a larger company, to go in with your eyes open and make sure that you're protecting the assets that keep you viable. If you don't do that, don't be surprised if you lose them. And so often this feeding frenzy or this sharing frenzy, I should say, occurs because the executive management is so excited about the fact that the company might acquire them and they'll get a huge exit bonus. And the thing is, if the company just takes your intellectual property, they don't have to pay you squat. If you haven't moved to protect it and recognize, patents in and of themselves aren't great protections. Companies have found ways around patents for years, and so they aren't great. Your best protection is keeping the things that are critical to your firm undercover until they can be protected by contract. And do recognize also that these contracts aren't always ironclad. When you're going to war against a larger firm in the legal arena, they can outspend you. One of the biggest cases I covered early on in my career was between Intel and NCR good book, and NCR, and NCR was right, and they won the case, but they had to exit the processor business because Intel brutalized them so badly during the process that they couldn't keep the business open. So recognize with large firms, they can bury you with litigation. So even with contracts, you're not assured. You really need to establish relationships. You need to put in place the protections you want, and you need to really understand whether the company has your interest at heart. In other words, whether you're doing something for them they couldn't get done otherwise, or whether it would be more expedient for them to just duplicate what it is you did and do it themselves. If the latter is the appropriate answer, then don't partner with that firm. It's probably going to end badly. Now, there are firms out there that do a really excellent job of partnering these days. I mentioned Dell. IBM actually does a tremendous job with regard to partnering and protecting these days. Microsoft actually does surprisingly well these days as well, better than before. But in all those cases, if you aren't careful and you're sharing your stuff without protecting or conserving it, nobody's going to be aggressively protecting your ass if a different department in the firm decides that they want to take some of that stuff and run with it. In fact, in some cases, they may not even know it came from you. They just heard it in a conversation or as part of another brief, and they might think it came from another internal group and it was open for conversion. So they don't even have to be thinking unethically. In fact, often they are not. They just got the idea. They don't remember where it came from, and they execute on it. And then you're left, wondering where your business went. And you might get a settlement out of court. Chances are it won't cover your business. And you just don't want to go down that process. Once you get into litigation with a larger firm, you've lost. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when, and because they can out-resource you, and you get a reputation for litigating against large businesses, and you get blacklisted, and now no large firm will touch you after the fact. One of the reasons why patent trolls survive so well in this business is because they don't need partnerships. Doesn't matter if they're blacklisted. They never plan to actually do anything with the technology. They just want to get money for the technology that they have and they hold, and chances are that's where your technology is going to end up at pennies for the dollar, is with some type of a patent troll. So making sure that isn't the outcome for your company becomes predominant. I'm not a huge fan of working with large firms unless you really know the internal workings of the firms, and unless you have relationships that carry up to executive management. So if you're mistreated, you have a way to mitigate the problem, or at least to address your grievances, short of court, because as they say, court probably won't be your end all be all. If you, in any battle you're going against, and court is a battle, if two parties go in, it's the reality that's created in court that wins the day. It has nothing to do with the reality of the world. I've been through a lot of litigation. Was a litigation strategist for a number of years. And one of the first things you learn in litigation to stay the hell out of it, unless you're an expert, and there are very few of us that are experts. And I don't consider myself one anymore. So go into these things with your eyes open, protect your ass, and then pick companies that are historically good at partnering, and avoid companies, and I put Apple at the top of this list, that are historically really bad at partnering and steal your crowd. And you'll probably do pretty well. Oh, one other thing. It's better off if you enter some of these arrangements when you're viable than when you're in the early stages, because you have a better capability of showcasing that you've been able to defend your technology, you brought it to market, and your defenses if it does get stolen are much stronger. If you're just at the idea phase and it gets stolen, and who's to say they didn't come up with the same idea at the same time you did or before? That becomes the evidentiary path that you have to take, and it's really difficult to sustain that. It's not surprising that people do manufacture evidence. I've seen that happen a number of times, even some of the most ethical firms I've worked with. So just recognize this is not for the faint of heart. If you're a small company, you're going to work for a big company, just figure it's like a small fish hanging around with a bunch of big barracuda. They'll be your buddies as long as your goals and issues are aligned. If they become unaligned, or if they become hostile, kiss your ass goodbye. So making sure you pick the right partner, making sure that you're well integrated in the process, and you understand the escalation path, and you have solid relationships throughout the company will serve you well. And then you can advance. Also, make sure it's clear in everybody's head whether your path is to partner and cooperate to keep the company and carry it forward, or if everybody's on board with the idea of just selling off, taking a check, and retiring. The conflicts between groups that want to sell and groups that don't want to sell can be legendary, even in small firms. I've been through that myself, and it is not at all fun. I think political drama that's going on in Brazil and the U.S. now is not fun. That can happen at a much smaller scale in companies. They can get pretty hostile. So just recognize there are issues you have to think through here, and if you don't think through them, you're going to exit the process much better educated and a lot poorer for the lack of understanding. Good luck.
Thank you, guys. Madam Ali.
Okay, as the other ideas that I've had experience of is most big companies have corporate social responsibility, and I think if your business is hitting kind of social education, environment, and things like that, there's also kind of possibilities to get supported through the departments that they've got. So, and we've had meetings with Google years and years ago, but they don't have CSR. So I think it's really interesting. And the other thing about that, there's also sponsorship. So presumably, you know, if you're doing something innovative and you can get people that are kind of big technology firms to support you as well, I think there's a kind of showing kind of innovation and best practice in a field where you're kind of pushing boundaries and making kind of profound changes is a really important thing to do. So that's kind of my other kind of thoughts on, you know, the particular service area that I'm in education. So, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Dr. Talib.
Okay, what I want to say here is the question was, how can big companies help small companies? That was the original question, not to distinguish between both of them or to characterize both of them. Now, I think one of the major distinctions is the possibility of creating jobs, because that's a major challenge nowadays, especially in the developing world. Creating jobs. Who creates more jobs and what are the jobs like? Now, small and medium-sized companies in our part of the world are different from small and medium-sized companies in the US. Now, David Smith talked about a small company. He talked about 40 to 70 million there. So that's a big company in our measures. I don't think that big and small can be distinguished like this. I think big and small has to be distinguished in relation to each other. Now, I think the big companies should be able to help the small companies by employing more people, by being environmentally sensitive, by being sustainably managed, and try to, as governments here, to support anything that is leading into that direction, whether it comes from the big or it comes from the small. Doesn't matter anymore. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Enig, what's your concluding remarks for today's session?
Well, I think the risk that Rob pointed out of joining big companies is true. I mean, we can even see if you do things like even open a store in Amazon, that Amazon isn't against duplicating everything you do and launching their own brand and putting you out of business like diapers.com. And that was a forced exit. And you see that in the government space too, for small business innovative research. Small company will figure something out, prove it's possible, then prove it's deliverable. And at that point, after that's a done deal, the big companies will say, oh, only we can deliver that. A small company can't do that. Take the contract away and give it to us. In doing that, you really need to look if what you have is valuable. If it's rare, you can't get anywhere else. But the two things is make sure that it's not imitatable. And make sure you're organized. We talked about getting the right balance. Make sure you're organized to deliver that. Like, there's a lot of companies that could tell you exactly what they do, and it would still be hard to do that. Because sometimes it's kind of like in Milan in the fashion industry. They've been trying to take that apart for years and say, we can make buttons better, we can make spread better, we can have designers. But it doesn't work because it's so tightly connected where you can call and the button person will come in. You'll have a button designed in a couple hours, where if you go overseas or out, you can't do that. So sometimes make sure that your organization stuff is can't copy. And I'll just say that we as a small company with maybe 12 to 14 people signed an agreement with Panasonic to basically put our software on their hardware, and we help them design their hardware to know how to do that. But that was a big concern because Panasonic could easily have said, oh, we'll get our own software to write that code that does that. So we took steps to make sure that it was really hard to imitate and really hard to do within Panasonic's organization to put the pieces together to need that. So yeah, there's a real risk there in working with big companies. They don't like to figure these little things out so much, but once somebody's figured it out for them, they love to take it now that the market and the plan and the path is clear. So, but working with big companies can give you the resources or the capabilities that you need, as long as you structure your business in a way that is not dependent on them and it is tough for them to take.
Thank you. Mr. David Smith.
Dr. Tlaib, you are right. When we went to that tens of millions of dollars, we grew from a small company to a medium-sized company. But it was the help with the big businesses and the government agencies that helped us grow from the small company to a medium-sized business. So I view that as a success story on the type of topic we're talking about today. So I guess you can say some of my companies in the past are living proof that this type of approach can help grow a small business. My advice, looking at the clock, this is probably my final advice on it, I guess, is that look at what's available to you. These programs are available internationally. I have done part of a small business initiative with Sony in Japan. I've done small business with Samsung in Korea and other places too. The EU has a lot of programs available for small businesses. A few of the companies that I'm on the board with in Europe, for example, in Greece, have gotten funds from the EU that will reimburse them for 75% of their development costs as a small business. So there's a lot of resources out there you can take advantage of. Some of the other ones, for example, Philips in Europe has a very, very active small business program that you can partner with. So my advice is to search and see what domains you're in, what vertical areas you're in. Look at both the large companies in those domains and also look at the large end customers, because many of them have small business programs as well. For example, I just Googled small business offices in Fortune 100. It looks like almost every one of them have small business offices. So, take advantage of the opportunities you have available and use them to help grow. And hopefully, using this help, you can grow from a small business to a medium-sized business to a large business by using the resources. And don't forget, relationships are the important part for making these happen. And avail yourself of that and the training that's available. So, Sharif, I think that's my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Michael. What's your concluding remarks?
I would say that the big companies need the small companies, but the small companies can grow maybe slower without the big ones. So if we imagine the big ones as giants, the giants will not survive without the people, without the small people who will feed them. So this is important to understand. And I will recommend everyone who would like really to deal with the big ones to be careful, as Rob says, because it is generally become a standard to take the knowledge over, and events like hackathons, challenges, where you sell your knowledge for few snacks and you lost everything, generally are so common that it's very dangerous to watch. I would like to recommend everyone who would like to really be careful this book, Negotiation with Giants. Sharif can send it to you. Is by Peter D. Jackson. It's a really great book. It's the only business book I read in my life, and it's really good. So I do recommend it and wish everyone to be successful in this world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Rob.
Well, Talib made a good point. Oh, and Talib, you might want to mute your microphone when you're not talking. We could hear you making your drink rather loudly. It made it hard to hear Michael when you were stirring. But made a good point. Large and small is relative. Some of the biggest disasters I've covered were Apple partnerships, the Apple partnership with Qualcomm, the Apple partnership with Intel. Most recently, but I also covered the Apple partnerships with IBM and Cisco, which also ended badly. And these are multi-billion-dollar companies. But Apple is $1 trillion company, and so has substantial resources that exceed $250 billion or $300 billion company, which I think where Intel is right now, or a $78 billion company where Qualcomm is. And even with IBM, which partnered with Apple outside of their heyday in the 90s. That still ended pretty badly with the two companies that they created together. So So the recognition is recognize that if you're the smaller partner, you're the weaker partner. When I was growing up, my dad reminded me of or told me of a saying, which is when there's a partnership, typically one partner has the money, the other partner has the experience. By the end of the partnership, the two have traded places. That's often the case when you're doing business with a larger firm. The larger firm is going to teach you some things. You're going to be much more knowledgeable after the partnership's over, but there's a good chance you're going to be a lot poorer as well. And that really comes to really understanding the process and making sure that you protect yourself through it. It really doesn't matter if you're a $1 million company or a $100 million company. If you're partnering with somebody that's substantially larger than you, and they want to behave badly, you're going to be screwed. And there is no great way to protect yourself. When you do get larger, it does make a lot of sense to not partner with firms that are so far out of your weight class that they can take advantage of you. Companies that do that well, that are good at partnering, are companies like AMD, who regularly partner with larger firms, but integrate themselves so well in those firms that they don't take advantage of them. Same thing with Qualcomm normally, the Apple being the exception. There's a saying in the Valley that people only do business with Apple once. That's because doing it twice would be painful. It is also funny that Intel did that, because Andy Grove in his book, and I spoke to him personally on this, one of his biggest regrets, other than going into the video conferencing business, which was a whole different story, was in re-engaging with Apple. Apple took him to task, and you might remember that Apple also partnered with HP on the iPod, and Carly Fiorina, who was the then CEO of the firm, lost her job over that deal, and she was taken apart by Steve Jobs most inelegantly. So do recognize that size disparity does put you at a disadvantage, and you need to find a way to mitigate that disadvantage, either by integrating yourself into the firm in such a way that they consider you as part of the whole. But do recognize that even internal divisions can get cut. So understanding the politics and playing the politics as aggressively as you can is very important. Ali mentioned some of the consortiums that are out there that you can get involved in. Many of the consortiums have self-protections in place to assure that the consortium members are not taken advantage of. It's certainly something to look at when you're talking about entering into engagements. Often there is security in numbers, and if a number of smaller firms get together and perform as a group, you may find that they can protect each other, but it has to be cooperative and collaborative. It can't be survival of the fittest. Otherwise, the smaller firms will just tear themselves apart, and the larger firm will walk away with all your assets or patent troll well, which is even more often the case. So it really is important that you come into these things with experience. Michael pointed out a book on negotiating with large companies that came after I did my graduate work. There were several books I studied, though, at the time that also talked about negotiating skills, and part of my job at IBM was negotiation. So I refined those. Developing negotiation skills, regardless of the job you have, is going to come into incredibly handy throughout your career, whether you're negotiating a higher salary or a better position, or negotiating a better contract with either a provider or a customer. It's the two things that have been surprisingly useful for me over the years are negotiating skills and acting skills. I cannot say enough how acting skills have been. I never made it as an actor. 4 years in acting, and I sucked. But the skills of being able to get in front of an audience and present, being able to repeat or work off a script if you had to, and thinking through what it is you're going to say as you would in improv, are incredibly useful as you come up through your career. So as you begin in your lives, and I know we're talking number of students, sometimes it's some of those side skills that you may not think apply to you, like negotiation, that can be incredibly useful and can make the difference throughout your life in terms of how you prevail or not throughout your different endeavors. Because even negotiating to buy a new car or a house, those things come in handy if you understand the dynamics, understand where the power is, understand where your levers are. You can always cut a much better deal when you enter the process knowledgeable and with good practices and great experience. If I were to pick any two things I couldn't do without, it would be negotiation skills acting well. I would also point out home economics, but there's a whole different story that goes along with that. Just being able to feed myself became very important for a good chunk of my life between the times before I was married. But those things and making sure that you develop those skills are very important to your future life. And when you're talking about these kinds of things, when you're negotiating with a larger firm, if you cannot find a way to get to parity in the negotiations, you probably should not be in the room. Entering a negotiation where you are only disadvantaged is a great way to screw yourself and screw your company. You need to understand where the company's score points are. You need to understand where your leverage is. And if you don't have leverage, you have no business in that room.
Madam Ali Rice, what's your concluding remarks?
From my point of view, I just think that the way forward is to kind of find opportunities and be brave and put yourself out there if you've got something to offer, and kind of demonstrate what you can do from, you know, proof of practice, really. And I think I've come a long way, and I started off as an artist that could draw, and it kind of took me around the world and back, and it's been a really interesting journey. But it really was. Actually, I set up the business supported by the Prince's Trust, which was Prince Charles before he became king. I was also a Livewire winner, and I think the thing is, you need to kind of promote what you do, and have some kind of meaning and purpose behind, because I think my goal really was to prove that creativity could promote change. It wasn't just about producing something, so there was much more depth of purpose. So I think having a depth of purpose and realizing how it can benefit, and the grassroots of things, so that you're making changes locally, because I was part of Creative Partnerships, which was a national campaign as well. And I think kind of making sure that you can kind of evidence what you do, and kind of scale it or kind of reproduce it. So you either essentially magnify what you do or multiply it so that people can do the same thing in other places. So I think, but those partnerships and kind of access to mentoring, and definitely here there's quite a lot of things set up for startups in the UK. I don't know whether there's equivalents. So the Prince's Trust still goes on now. And I think there's kind of, Steve and I are in contact with the Commonwealth funding at the moment. So kind of finding partnerships that are overseas as well, so that you can bring two kind of separate people together. It's really interesting. So yeah, where there's a will, there's a way.
Thank you, Dr. Talib Rafal. What's your concluding remarks?
Okay. I think Ali and Rob and Michael, they talked about, basically, they concentrated themselves on how does a small firm negotiate with a bigger firm, the giants there. And that's part of the problem. But the problem really is, what do we as societies, what do we cherish more? What should we be emphasizing on more? Is it big companies or small companies? Or how big, how small these companies are? I think that's the more important part in it. Because the negotiation between the small and the big one, Rob, is important, but it's important only for the survival of the small one. Now, the small one may not be providing enough jobs and may not be so valuable to the society. So what I'm concentrating on in my final remarks here is what's good for the society is good for all of us. And what's good for the society is employment, jobs, and sustainability. So we need to look at that and see how the best way that big companies can help small companies in that. They can help them. They don't need to absorb them. They don't need to buy them off as they usually do. That's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining today's sessions. World Talent Economy Forum working for SME foundations, and we are doing research and innovation. Those who want to join in our forum, specifically as a speaker, as an entrepreneur, as an investors, I want to welcome you all. And beside that, this year's May 10 to 12, we have very, very special conference on Nikola Tesla Technology Conference. I want to invite you all in our conference. Those who want to submit your abstract, research paper abstract, you can submit to our website. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Right.
Bye.
Bye bye, and thank you.
Bye. Thank you.